Welcome to this IUPsyS President's Symposium sponsored by Wiley Publishers on the global implications of open science. I'm Pam Morass and I'm President of the International Union of Psychological Science, which I will refer as IUPsyS for brevity, as that's its acronym. So the International Union of Psychological Science is psychology's global voice. Our mission is to serve humanity and science through the integration of psychological science into solutions to global problems. We do that by supporting the development, representation and advancement of psychology as a basic and applied science, nationally, regionally and internationally for public good. We're not bound by borders, and we have formal international links with a number of people, including the International Science Council, the World Health Organization, and the United Nations. Our members are national members, so organizations that represent psychology within their countries, and encompassed within that is over 2 million psychologists. So open science is a core aspect of IUPsyS current considerations. Our position, though, is that the benefits of and for open science must not be limited by economic and other barriers in some countries. Global science perspectives take many different positions. They include open access, science communication, the pre-registration of data, and replicability. But for us, a key aspect of open science is that it's inclusive. Recently, UNESCO have drafted some recommendations on open science. IUPsyS contributed to comments on those. We did that through the International Science Council, and our first speaker may refer to those. And we did that because we think it's important that there is a global comment on open science, or global recommendations on open science. For us, a number of main points occur in relation to those recommendations. The first is that they maintain the highest scientific standards and inclusivity and allow for cultural and other complexity, a difficult task. The second, that recommendations involve stakeholders, including users of science from the start. A third point is that not just the UNESCO draft recommendations, but many initiatives refer in the main to quantitative or numerical data. Psychology actually produces a lot of qualitative data, much of which supports quantitative data, and indeed is used to promote initiatives and policies to support changes, for example, in health. And finally, no initiative, no recommendations are any good at all unless they're accepted and adopted and acted on by the people at whom they're aimed. And so what we suggest is that behavioural scientists or psychologists should advise on the promotion and adoption of open science whenever that's possible. So parity and access is a key feature of our thoughts on open science. There's a number of unintended negative consequences that could occur because of open science practices. For example, the increased costs of article processing charges, the exploitation and privatization of data from technologically more advanced countries or entities, and loss of intellectual property and knowledge. They're just a few examples. Now, I'm sure there's others. We feel, though, that they can be addressed in relation to thinking about how we work to develop recommendations and initiatives and how we collaborate in order to do that and ensure there's equity of contribution and access to outputs generated by higher income countries. What we're saying here is what we need to avoid is an open access colonization where science, psychological science in this instance, is a one-way street. It needs to come from as well as go to all countries across the globe. And that has major implications, has major funding and resource implications for the ability of scientists in low and middle income countries to contribute to open science. So our esteemed speakers today, there are 5 of them, will each give a presentation in turn. We will do it, we will run one after the other because it's easier and there's more of a flow. But at the end of the symposium, we will have a panel where we will address questions that have either been asked to specific speakers during the Congress, during the symposium, or general questions. So please, 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 throughout the symposium, if you've got a question, put it in. Just think of it, put it in, and we will address it at the end. Our first speaker will be Heide Hackman, and we'll talk about open science in relation to the International Science Council, where she's Chief Executive Officer. Our second speaker is Sarah Oates, who's Senior Editorial Director at Wiley Publishing, and we'll talk about open access from the point of view of a global publisher. Darrell O'Connor, who's chair of the research board of the BPS and convener of the Board of Scientific Affairs at EFPA, and also does extensive work with the Open Science Network, will then talk about moving psychological science forward, some thoughts from a global perspective. Our fourth speaker will be Abigail Goetz, who's editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Psychology. The International Journal of Psychology is the journal of the International Union of Psychological Science. It's the only generic international journal in psychology. She will talk about promulgating open science in journals. And finally, Germán Gutiérrez, who's an executive committee member of IUPsyS, will talk about the open science and the growth of psychology in Latin America. As I say, at the end of this symposium, or the end of, after all the 5 speakers have spoken, we will have 15 or so minutes in which we'll answer questions and address any points that people want to raise. So please, please, please put your questions in the chat, and I look forward to hearing you speak. I'd like to finally end by thanking Wiley for supporting this symposium. It's a really important piece of work, and I'm sure what we talk about today will only be the start of a conversation which we'll all be able to continue to be involved with. I'd also say that the symposium is recorded, so you'll be able to look at it online afterwards, either in your own time zone or you can look at it as it's being recorded. So thank you very much. I'll ask Heide to take over now and start our symposium.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Heide Hackman. I am the CEO of the International Science Council, the ISC, and I'm really pleased to be part of today's discussion on open science. In my short presentation, I want to share with you the ISC's perspective on and understanding of open science, give you an overview of the range of open science activities that the Council is currently leading on or supporting, and share some thoughts on the contemporary opportunities and challenges for open science. By way of introduction, and for those unfamiliar with the Council, the ISC is a global membership-based organization established in 2018 as a result of the merger of the International Council for Science and the International Social Science Council. The ISC today brings together 40 international scientific unions and associations, including the International Union of Psychological Science, as well as national, regional, and international academies, research councils, and other representative bodies of science from over 140 countries. Our vision is of science as a global public good, and our mission is to be the global voice for science. The Council works to convene expertise and influence across scientific fields, disciplines, regions, and stakeholder communities in order to address issues of major concern to both science and society. Our current portfolio of activities falls into 4 domains of action: the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, the Digital Revolution, Science and Policy and Public Discourse, and the Evolution of Science and Science Systems. Now, the work of articulating and advocating at a global level principles, policies, and practices in support of open science cuts across each of these domains. For the Council, open science is about advancing the rigor, the reliability and the relevance of science, of all science, in addressing the complexities of the contemporary world. It is central to our commitment to safeguarding scientific freedom and responsibility, and foundational to the pursuit of our vision of science as a global public good. As a bedrock for the value of science to society, the imperative of openness is not new to science. Open science essentially originated in the 17th century with the publication of scientific journals, but its horizons have broadened rapidly and significantly in recent decades, inspired by several convergent trends, including changes in the social and political expectations of science and enlarged opportunities for scientific discovery, for communication and dissemination that have been made possible by the tools of the digital revolution. Today's open science movement embraces several diverse perspectives. And the ISC frames an inclusive definition of open science as science that is open to scrutiny and challenge, and to the knowledge needs and interests of wider publics. And we emphasize three key imperatives at the heart of that definition. Firstly, making the record of science, its evolving stock of knowledge, ideas, and possibilities accessible and free to all. Secondly, making the data and evidence of science accessible to and reusable by all. And thirdly, being open to engagement with other societal actors in the common pursuit of new knowledge. And the ISC acts on each of these three imperatives. On the record of science, we are leading an international project on the future of scientific and scholarly publishing. In a first phase, the project published an agreed set of principles that, from the perspective of the international scientific community, should underlie publishing if we are to realize the potential of open science. In the current second phase of the project, the ISC seeks to collaborate with its members, with national and international funders, with universities, open science bodies, publishers, and individual scientists to create a powerful and broadly based coalition for change to ensure that the processes of efficient dissemination and use of scientific work are central parts of a revitalized open science. On data, the Council is sponsoring a decadal program designed to facilitate data interoperability between the different disciplines of science. The underlying purpose here is to enable the effective integration of data streams from different disciplines in supporting interdisciplinary work on global challenges. And this program is led by the Council's Committee on Data, known as CODATA. In addition, we are engaging with partners in considering action in response to pressing questions about how global scientific data should best be governed. On open engagement and beyond core ongoing work that we are involved in at the Global Science Policy Practice Interface, the ISC has for many years advocated the adoption of transdisciplinary approaches to the co-design and co-production of knowledge with societal stakeholders in international science and funding initiatives. We mobilize and manage resources for transdisciplinary research and capacity building, and we support the development of an international community of transdisciplinary practice. Beyond these specific targeted activities, and with the understanding that the pursuit of open science poses a systemic challenge that requires work on a broader set of enabling conditions, the ISC is actively engaged in supporting the development of open science platforms in the Global South, with an African open science platform, which is now hosted by South Africa's National Research Foundation, as the first concrete deliverable in addressing concerns about persistent global knowledge divides, and indeed in this domain, about new divides in the global scientific effort to harness the benefits of data-intensive open science as a fundamental resource for society. The ISC is also convening international scientific input and support for the development of a UNESCO recommendation on open science, a standard-setting instrument to be adopted by UNESCO member states hopefully later this year, and potentially a very powerful intervention from UNESCO in this domain. And finally, the Council is now exploring, in collaboration with our partners, the Inter-Academy Partnership and the Global Young Academy, the design and delivery of appropriate action at a global level in response to long-standing concerns about the barriers to openness posed by existing systems of research evaluation and metrics. Colleagues, the potential of open science has been exemplified during the COVID-19 pandemic by the enormous range of scientific knowledge that has been spontaneously and rapidly mobilized to cope with the pandemic's diverse aspects. It has been underpinned by an unprecedented sharing of ideas and data within and beyond the scientific community and across the public-private interface. A new normal for science must absorb its lessons. But it must also take stock of and address some of the science system weaknesses that pose barriers to open science and that the pandemic has highlighted and in some cases amplified, including, for example, growing inequalities within and between science systems, new barriers to international scientific collaboration with new funding constraints and new geopolitical tensions fueling concerns about research security and trends to scientific nationalism, as well as business as usual policies and practices that quite simply promote cultures of competition and do not enable the pursuit of science as a global public good. Now is the time to walk the talk of open science, to move from convening global debate and articulating agreed global perspectives and principles to building coalitions of common purpose and of action. For the ISC, this means working much more closely with its globally distributed and disciplinary diverse membership and with partners, notably UNESCO, to become an effective agent of change in this domain. Open science is not a luxury, it is a necessity. It is about the future of science and about science for the future. And I look forward to today's discussion on the priorities for action, also of the International Union of Psychological Science, towards shaping that future. Thank you for your attention.
Hello, I'm Sarah Oates and I'm Wiley's Senior Editorial Director for our Psychology and Human Behaviour Journals programme. I'm here to talk about open science, a view from a global publisher perspective. Firstly, before I start, I want to say I'm really delighted to be here today. My team and I are passionate about open science and we've done a lot over the last few years to make our programme more open. So I'm hoping today that I might persuade you to adopt some new open science practices yourselves. But before I do, where do you place yourself on this chart? Are you amongst the early adopters or are you in the late majority? If you're based in the UK, Netherlands or Australia, you're more likely to be amongst the early adopters or in that early majority. Whereas you might be surprised to hear if you're in the US, Canada or Germany, you're more likely to be later to the open science party. Another thing that was surprising, and this was a study from Brian Nosek, was that your stage in your career depends on how open you are to open science initiatives. So I would have thought that full professors would be much more pro-open science, be much more confident in making their research openly available. But what Brian Nosek found was actually that it was the early career researchers that are more embracing of open science initiatives. And there's even a difference by different parts of psychology. So social and cognitive psychologists are much more likely to embrace open science initiatives than those working in clinical psychology and health. So I'm hoping wherever you are on this scale, by the end of this talk, I might have moved you a little bit along towards a more open science perspective. Open science divides into 5 different areas: open access, open data, open practices, open collaboration, and open recognition and reward. I'm only going to have time to talk about the top 3 today: open access, open data, and open practices. So let's talk about open access in psychology. But before I do, just a quick primer on the different types, or the two main types of open access. So there's green, where there's no charge, a 12 to 24-month embargo on the accepted manuscript, and then you can deposit that in an institutional repository. And then there's gold. There's article publication charges for that, usually paid by your institution or your funder. There's no embargo. Your article is made immediately freely available on the publisher's website. So what's been happening in open access in psychology over the last few years? Well, let's take a look at this green line. Pretty amazing. So this is the growth of all kinds of open access in psychology from 2012 up until 2020. And as you can see, it's gone from just under 30,000 open access articles to over 60,000 in that short period of time. So doubled between 2012 and 2020. Then let's take a look at this purple line. So this shows you the number of gold open access articles being published. And you can see that really started to take off from 2017, just 4 years ago. And from that time, you can see there was around about 20,000 articles being published gold open access in 2017, up to an amazing 40,000 in 2020. There's also been growth in non-open access, but as you can see, quite small by comparison. So what's really exciting here is it's showing a transition from towards a more open world for psychology, which is really exciting. There are advantages of publishing open access. So we just recently did a study looking at articles that have been published in the last 4 years. And we found that on average, they receive open access articles receive 3 times as many downloads, 2 times as many citations, and 4.5 times the altmetric score of subscription articles. Altmetric accounts for things like Twitter mentions, mentions in the press, and also citations in policy documents. But as I said, open science is more than open access. Let's take a look at open data, and specifically, let's look at open data in psychology. There are lots of different places you can store your data, from Harvard Dataverse to regional repositories like the UK Data Archive, society-led repositories like the APA and Centre for Open Science repository. There are subject-specific repositories like PsychArchives, and then those that are even more focused like Neurovault for brain mapping and Databree for developmental scientists. Your institutional funder can probably give you a good idea of where you might want to put your data. We did a study a couple of years ago on researchers' open practices for open data and found that these were the top 4 reasons for researchers sharing their data. The first was for public benefit, then for transparency and reuse, for increased visibility of research, and finally because it was a journal requirement. Well, this struck us as an opportunity to make a contribution as a publisher and look at our data requirements in our journals, which we did. And we moved from an encouraging data sharing policy to expecting a data availability statement. Now, a data availability statement doesn't mean you have to make your data available if you can't for certain reasons. But what it does require is that if you can't, you have to state why. So you either make it available or you have a statement as to why you can't. Here's an example from the British Journal of Psychology. As you can see, it's very clearly pinpoints where the data is available and links to it. Some societies have taken a data policy even further. This is a really exciting development from the Society for Research in Child Development. They've not only been thinking about making data openly available, but they've been thinking about the data that's collected in the first place from a diversity perspective. This new policy was launched at their conference earlier this year. So they require authors to make a statement about the theoretically relevant characteristics of the sample studied, for example, race and ethnicity, the socioeconomic status, the native language, the gender identity and religion of the participants. They also require information about the places from which that sample was drawn, including the country, city, region, neighbourhood, school, and any other relevant contextual variables, except of course where it might violate expectations around privacy and confidentiality. And finally, they require the author to explain the selection and recruitment procedures of the study participants. So this is a really exciting development, not only from an open science perspective, but also because it encourages more diversity in the research that we do and in the participants that we select. So we've covered open access and open data. I'm just going to take you through a couple of last things on open practices. And because we're short of time, I'm just going to talk about preprints and registered reports. So I decided on preprints because there's still a lot of uncertainty around whether you can and can't out there. That's a question I'm quite often asked by authors. So quick quiz, true or false? Will journals let you submit your article if you've published it as a preprint? Well, the answer is it used to be true. Journals wouldn't let you submit your article if you published it as a preprint. But nowadays it's false. You can publish a preprint and submit to a journal. This has been a change within the last couple of years, and now journals are very embracing of authors submitting their articles as a preprint. So I just wanted to clear that up because it's a question that I'm often asked. There are lots of different places you can publish your preprint, from OSF preprints, which is a general place, to more specific OSF SCI archive and SOC archive. There's preprints.org, which is owned by the publisher NDPI, and SSRN and Mendeley and by Elsevier and ResearchGate. So lots of different places, and this is just a few that I mentioned here. But I really want to spend the last few minutes talking about registered reports. This is an exciting development in terms of the way that we do publishing, but also the way that we conduct research. Before I do, I'm going to talk about some of the benefits and hopefully persuade you to do a registered report yourself in the future. So who's felt like this in the last year? Have you ever had a paper rejected? We recently did a study and we tracked papers from submission to finally being accepted, and found that many authors go through 2, 3, even 4 journals before they finally find a place for their article. The top 3 reasons for rejection are mismatch with journal scope, lack of originality and significance, remember that, it's important later on, and flaws in the study design. This is also important. Now, the reason I've highlighted those 2 reasons for rejection is that registered reports work in a different way. When you submit to the journal, you submit your protocol first, you submit your study design, and you get feedback on that. And because the feedback has been given by the journal on your study design, that means they can make you an unconditional offer on publishing the research, regardless of whether it's original or significant. They just want to know that you've conducted the sound research. You also get a review stage when you submit your article. So it's a really great way, kind of fail-safe way really, to ensure that you can get your article published. There are 295 journals offering registered reports right now, and a great number of them are in health, science, neuroscience, and psychology. You can find the full list across publishers on the Centre for Open Science. We started offering registered reports in psychology back in 2018, and the British Psychological Society were the first to jump on board with this. And we worked with Darryl O'Connor, who's chair of their research board and who's presenting later on, to roll out registered reports across the full portfolio of the BPS journals. Today, we offer registered reports across many of our titles in psychology, including some of the top in their field, like Child Development, the Journal of Organisational Behaviour, and the Journal of Personality, for example. Feedback has been really amazing, particularly on that stage 1 feedback on the study design. That's been really important to researchers in order to ensure that they conduct their research in the best way possible and knowing that they're going to get published when that research has been done. So if I haven't done enough to encourage you to embrace any open science practices today, I'll just leave you with one last thought, and that's that universities have also started to reward openness. So you can see lots of examples of it, again, on the Centre for Open Science website. But Loughborough University, for example, have said that openness will be equally valued in recruitment, promotion, personal development reviews, reward and promotion. And Charité University, it's a medical university in Berlin, have experimented with offering a €1,000 research bonus for publication of null results, replication studies, pre-registered clinical studies, and papers that use data that's been previously published by others. So what I want to leave today saying is that open science isn't just the future, it's actually the here and now. More and more publishers are supporting you in becoming an open scientist. And I hope that I've encouraged you to experiment yourselves and moved you a little bit along that chart to being an adopter. So thank you very much. And we look forward to seeing your open science research in one of the journals in the future. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Darrell O'Connor, and I want to talk to you about some of my ideas on how we can move psychological science forward. And in particular, we're going to talk about some of the global perspectives on this, but in particular, I want to focus on two aspects, as well as a couple of others, but in particular, pre-registration and registered reports. So as a useful starting point, let's consider what the threats are to reproducible science. So I don't need to tell anybody in this audience today, but there's this key paper published by Marcus Manafo and colleagues a number of years ago, in which they identify a range of what we call questionable research practices, which we know are associated with low levels of replication and reproducibility. And again, I won't go into detail here, but what I think is important, what we should be doing globally and as an international scientific community, is that we should try and think about turning these threats into opportunities. And there are four ways that I think we can do this. There's many others, but I just want to focus on these four: pre-registration, registered reports, reproducibility of meta-analyses, and increased use of open data. So let's consider this a little bit further. So let's think first of all about pre-registration. I suspect many of you know what pre-registration is. As the name suggests, it's when we pre-register our research in advance. What I think is really important to draw a distinction, though, is that what's at the heart of pre-registration is this difference between confirmatory research and exploratory research, hypothesis testing versus hypothesis generating. And both of these are important, but what's key is that we don't misrepresent hypothesis testing with hypothesis generating research. And pre-registration as a way to help us do that, where we pre-register ideas, plans in advance. But it's fair to say that psychological scientists have been really, many of us have been pre-registering aspects of our work for a long time. So here's examples of registers for clinical research trials. So psychologists work in this area, in behavior change, etc. And we've been using these registers. And also we've been really good in registering systematic reviews and meta-analysis on databases such as Prospero, but there's still lots of room for improvement. But to me, if you want to really give a strong rationale on why we should pre-register, just look at this example. This is a great paper published by Robert Kaplan and colleagues back in 2015. And what Kaplan did was they compared in clinical trials funded in one particular area looking at heart and lung research, whether or not there's a difference in the number of null findings before it became pretty much mandatory to register trials back in 2000 compared to post that. And if you look at the slide here, what's really quite remarkable is that pre-2000, 57% of studies found significant beneficial effects for their intervention. Compare that with only 8% after 2000. This suggests the real strength of pre-registration is that maybe it removes the noise in the data. And again, I won't go into the rationale why we think that is, but ultimately it might be to do with the reduced use of changing hypotheses, changing outcomes, and a reduction in the use of questionable research practices. But if we move on to pre-registration and how we might do it, well, there's easy and more difficult ways of doing it. So some of the easiest ways of doing this is through online tools such as Predicted. So As Predicted is a tool that I've certainly used a lot. And it's an online registration tool where it involves researchers just simply asking 9 straightforward questions here. So again, just Google it and you'll find out a bit more information on it. But it's an easy way of making your hypotheses public, if that's what you choose, in advance. But crucially, once your colleagues have answered these key 9 questions, you can then agree to, all of you agree to that, and then we will, then there's a digital online identifier is then given to these hypotheses, which means that you have them for all of eternity. But also I think is an important tool during COVID when people were galloping forward with research very quickly, but using as predicted is an easy way of pre-registering in advance. And there's other different tools out there as well in the Open Science framework. But I would urge people to use these tools if you aren't using them already. But anyway, more broadly, pre-registration is a big area. And I and others have been part of what's called this international task force on pre-registration. So again, how the whole global community can work together to ensure this increased research transparency. And one of the things we were interested in doing was to establish common pre-registration standards, particularly for quantitative research in this context. So it came together with the German Psychological Society, the British Psychological Society, colleagues in Germany who are very interested in open science, and the Centre of Open Science itself. And we've worked over the last nearly 2 years to develop a template for the pre-registration. This template has recently been published or accepted for publication in the American Psychologist. And again, you can read the preprint here at the link below, or Google template for pre-registration, and you will find it. And what we've done in this template is we've tried to bring together all the really excellent aspects of the templates that are out there. And as you can see here, the PRP, Pre-Registration in Psychological Science quantitative template, allows you then to give you guidance on from simple things about registering your title, through conflicts of interest, through your analysis plan, your design questions, and every aspect of the research process. But it gets you to register these basic ideas in advance, but in a really systematic way. And again, we hope this will be used by many scientists across the world, but also it might help inform registered reports, which I'll talk about in a little second. And I should say as well, if you look at this link here, that again, this is a sustainable link, which you can download the template in many different formats. That's all I want to say about pre-registration. I want to now move briefly on and talk about registered reports. And I know that Sarah Oates has mentioned these earlier in her excellent presentation on the work that Wiley have been doing, and more broadly, how the publishers have been responding to open science demands. The registered reports, as she has outlined, is where peer review happens before the results are known. So the key issue is that you develop an idea, you design a study, and then at that stage, you send off your introduction and your method for peer review. Then once that's reviewed and been revised and accepted, you then collect your data. And once the data collected and analysed, and you write your discussion, then the report is published in the scientific journal, irrespective of the results. And that's crucial, because what we know is that the file drawer problem is that often it's only positive or exciting or novel findings which are published in the scientific literature. And I'll show you in a second why that's important. So registered reports is something that certainly I've been involved in my roles in the British Psychological Society. And what we decided to do a number of years ago was we wanted to become the very first psychological society in the world to offer registered reports to all of our journals. And indeed, we launched that back in 2008 or 2009. We had a period of time of introducing this. But what I think it's important to point out, when we did launch this, I just put my glasses on to read my own quotation, but the reason why we did it was because we believe that the introduction of registered reports will increase transparency of our science and allow peer review of research studies before the results are known. As a consequence, this will help reduce the use of questionable research practices while improving the quality of our research protocols that will ultimately improve the robustness of our evidence base. And again, it's important that we all, as global citizens in science, think about the different areas in which we can engage in open science. And registered reports is one really, really big step forward. And I'm really proud to say that of all the British Psychological Society's journals, the very first one that published a registered report was last year, and it was the British Journal of Health Psychology. I'm a health psychologist, so I'm thrilled by that. But I alluded to this earlier. Why is it should we care about registered reports? Well, look at these data. This is a great paper by Anne Schneal and colleagues, where they compared standard papers published in psychological journals and the percentage where the first hypothesis was supported. And they can see here that nearly 90% of papers published standard articles find support. This drops to around 40%. And ultimately, this suggests to us, as the title indicates, there are an excess of positive results published in the scientific literature. Registered reports will start removing that noise and improving our overall scientific database, or our evidence base. So the final couple of things I want to say is that certainly me as an editor, I have editor of this journal called Cogent Psychology, and where we want to offer and welcome the whole global community to publish all types of open science methods. And again, if you're interested, have a look at this website. But also, there's other areas in which we can try and improve science. One is through meta-analyses. Again, back in 2016, and I've written about this more recently in 2020, Daniel Atkins has argued there's open science should also be applied to meta-analyses. And again, I'm not going into detail here, but I'm just highlighting the point that our basic cornerstone of cumulative science is a meta-analysis, and we need to improve our practices in that regard too. But pretty much everything I've said in this talk so far, I've summarized in this paper just published late last year, where we talk about the architecture of science and how that can be improved and how pre-registration can be improved also. But the final couple of things I want to point to is this idea that we in the global scientific community should also think carefully about how we incentivize open science. And one way is through open science badges. And we can see very clearly in this study here that after open science badges have been introduced, clear evidence of a major uptake in open data. So if you know journal editors and publishers and societies, we should be encouraging their use of open science badges, an easy way to promote reproducible science in the long run. Open data is another thing that we should be promoting, and certainly globally and in the United Kingdom, we've recently published an open data statement in which we say here, at the below here, we say, we recognize the principle as open as possible, as closed as necessary. Because there will be situations where, and times where researchers aren't able to publish open data in qualitative context, for example, in other sensitive contexts, but we should do it when necessary. So what can we conclude? Well, in my final minute or two, I would argue that pre-registration is a very straightforward way which can help improve transparency of science. I'd urge you all to, if you haven't, try and consider using the PRP Quant template to pre-register your research. Even by doing the process will improve your science. Registered reports are a really important tool to improve science. And I think in the longer term, they will become more the norm than the exception. And as I've written about elsewhere, science is a series of behaviors. And bottom line is that if that's the case, we as psychological scientists know how to change behavior, then we should be employing these techniques to help other scientists to do the same. And then the final point I'll make is we are aware that there's a global message here that open science is something we should all be engaging in. But we have to make sure that none of the aspects of open science are prohibitive to countries where income might be lower and when there may be inequalities. So open science methods should be available for all countries. So final thing is, I hope you enjoy the rest of this session. I hope you've enjoyed listening to this symposium. Bye for now.
Good day, everybody. And it's a treat to be with you. I just wish it was in person. My name's Abby Gewirtz, and I am the editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Psychology, which is the journal of the International Union of Psychological Science, and the only interdisciplinary international psychological journal. I am really pleased to announce that we just found out that our 2020 impact factor was 2.0 for those of you who are interested. But what is most exciting to me as the editor-in-chief of the International Journal, or IJP as we call it, is that in 2020, IJP received submissions from authors in more than 80 countries around the world. And we are really proud that we are able to have authors submit their articles from so many countries around the world. So I'm going to talk briefly about a journal perspective on promulgating open science. So I'll only very briefly talk about what open science is. I'm sure other presenters have or will discuss that. Primarily focus on what does open science mean for journals, and particularly for authors who are interested in submitting to journals. I'll talk about the International Journal of Psychology in particular, and then I'll just spend a couple of minutes talking about open access publishing. So what is open science? Very briefly, a movement to make science and knowledge generation publicly and freely available. So here what we're focused on with open science is increasing accountability, transparency, and replicability in psychological science. And I think there's pretty good data now to show that it's rewarding for researchers to use open science, in that research that is more open, transparent, and replicable is associated with increases in citations, media attention, potential collaborators, job opportunities, and funding opportunities. And that's from a paper by McKiernan and colleagues, including Brian Nosek, in 2016. So from the researcher perspective, how can you as a researcher enhance the transparency of your studies? And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about it chronologically. I'm a researcher myself. I study interventions to promote parenting in families affected by trauma and stress, and so I'll give some of my work as an example. But before you start your research, you might consider registering your protocol or review, if you're doing a review or meta-analysis, in a publicly accessible database. And these databases are free, and they're pretty straightforward, and they include things like Prospero, which is based in the UK for systematic reviews and meta-analyses, and in the United States, clinicaltrials.gov for registering hypotheses, methods, and measures for experimental studies. So the advantage of registering your protocol and review ahead of time is that you're very transparent, and you're stating ahead of time what your hypotheses are, and then when you go and test them and you write up the study, it's very clear that you haven't a posteriori changed what you were predicting based on the results you find. And then when you have finished gathering your data, you can make your data accessible in an online repository. For example, the Open Science Framework, which actually is a soup to nuts website that allows you to do all of the above: register and also register your hypotheses and measures, and also share your data. So here's an example in the OSF registry of a paper that my students have been taking the lead on. It's now under review, and included in OSF are the rationale for the study, the key questions, the search methods so that anyone can replicate the search by using the same search terms as us, and then also you can store your files, your findings, the papers that you cite, and things like that. And here's one more in Prospero, which is the British-based registry, and this is another. In this case, this is a meta-analytic study, and here are examples of the questions that we were asking, as well as the details of the search and inclusion criteria and things like that. So open science we know that open science is a really good thing, and open science is very important in psychology to address the what's been called the replicability crisis, which is refers to the process by which we have increasingly found that it's, particularly in some areas of psychology, it's hard to replicate findings. And in the International Journal of Psychology, we do place high value on replication studies. And so if you are someone who's interested in replication, I would really encourage you to conduct a replication study. And I think scholars find sometimes that journals are not interested in replications because they're the same, and then what's the incremental contribution to science? And I would say would be authors in IJP that we welcome replication studies, and what I would say is, in your submission, what you should argue for is what added value this replication is. So it's very likely that you'll be replicating a finding in another context or another country, and therefore you'll be extending the generalizability of the findings. So that's one thing that's really important when you're interested in submitting a replication study. I digress. I'm going to come back to open science, and I just want to talk a little bit about the potential hazards of open science, or the unintended consequences. So open science is very important, and we know it's a good thing, and it can increase collaboration, it can increase accessibility, it can provide opportunity for people who are interested in understanding a little bit of the black box behind studies. But it's very important to note that it was developed by people in high-income countries, and it can be quite cumbersome, particularly for researchers who are in low-resourced settings, such as low and middle-income countries. So, for example, a study registered in a repository like Prospero can take months to be approved, and that in itself can be a burden. The time to register protocols can take a long time, and placing measures and data in a repository can not only take extra time, but it also can be problematic for some investigators. And of course, once the data are made publicly available, anybody can access them, and that is to the advantage of high resource settings that have lots of people who want to access data, and that can be to the disadvantage potentially of people who are in lower resource settings where research takes longer to do because you have fewer people and less other financial resources, for example. And so those are some things to consider when we think a little bit about open science and its unintended consequences. Having a data sharing policy can be a compromise, and as a journal editor, I would really encourage people to consider how their open science practices impact researchers in lower and middle income countries, and possibly ensure that there is equity across across the ability to be able to access data and also deposit data. And I'll give you one brief example from a conference I was at for journal editors who do international work last week, where one of the researchers who does a lot of work in low and middle income countries noted that internet access can be a really significant barrier, and if you're working purely online, as one does with a repository, data repository, lack of internet access can be a real barrier to people who either want to put their work online or access data from online repositories. Examples of open science tools, Center for Open Science, that I'm sure other people will have talked about. And then just briefly, in terms of publications, I want to say that IJP does not require either pre-registration or data sharing, recognizing the burden that I discussed of these steps. But we do require steps to ensure that transparency. For example, we do require authors to engage in standard reporting for review articles. For example, following the PRISMA statement, if you want to do a review or meta-analysis, you must include a PRISMA flowchart and follow PRISMA requirements. And we do welcome and encourage submissions with pre-registration and open data, and we are seeing increases in the number of submissions with open data. And finally, I just want to talk very briefly about open access. As all authors know, sometimes you can submit your article to a subscription journal, which requires no payment from the submitting author. And sometimes you submit your article to an open access journal, which does require authors to pay a fee, sometimes more than $1,000 US. IGP is a hybrid journal, so we are primarily a subscription journal, and it's free for authors to publish. But you do have the option of paying an article fee to have your paper published as open access, which means it's freely available to all readers. And we are seeing a slight increase over the years in open access submissions. Just a word about open access journals. The challenge, of course, is for an fully open access journal is the cost to submit an article unless you are part of an institution or a country that already has a negotiated contract with a publisher, which most low and middle income countries do not. And that makes it very prohibitive, and I am very concerned as a journal that received submissions from 80 countries last year that we would not receive such a broad array of submissions if we were fully open access. It's also really important to note that some open access journals are predatory, and they use open access as a way to bring in income, but they pay little attention to quality control, such as the review process. So that's just a note of warning. I'm done. I'm really looking forward to questions, comments, and a lively discussion, and I just want to say thank you.
Hello, my name is Germán Gutiérrez from the National University of Colombia. The title of my presentation is Open Science and the Growth of Psychology in Latin America. I want to thank Dr. Pam Maras, President of IUPsyS, for the kind invitation to this very important and interesting symposium. The Open Science movement is based on the principles that scientific knowledge should be available to the public. That means it should be transparent in its conception, its development, its data collection and analysis, the results it provides, and the communication process both with the specialized public and the general public. We know, of course, that there are limitations to this principle, but we also feel that currently there is ample space for improvement in that area. Open space is also expected to improve the quality of research and the reach and quality of applications. Given that open science is based on the core idea that humanity is capable of cooperating and not only competing, it is expected to promote innovation to benefit humanity as a whole and not only to limited populations. Even the idea that the goal is the benefit of humanity is to a certain degree questioned, especially in recent decades when we have realized the tremendous impact of our species on nature as a whole, in most cases in a negative way. Open access to knowledge clearly has not been the norm through history. However, some societies have understood that some level of public access to knowledge and technology was beneficial for the promotion of innovation and understanding of nature. Access to knowledge has not been linear, as any reader of the history of science quickly discovers. Both the Portuguese and Spanish empires were constructed on the basis of making knowledge a secret. They were also constructed on a Christian ideology that somehow identified knowledge with a dangerous path to sin. The combination of these ideas had the implication that the production of knowledge and its communication was highly discouraged under the supervision of the crown and the close scrutiny of the Catholic Church. Thus, during colonial times, naturalistic views of the world were seen with a suspicion, and knowledge was controlled, stored, and made secret in many cases. Even today, historians of science continue to find naturalistic studies produced during colonial times in archives in Spain and in certain parts of Latin America. Some analysts of science in the region argue that this tradition has affected the development of science in Latin America, and it has taken academia a long, long time to recover from the negative impact of that tradition of many centuries. Paradoxically, it is possible that this lack in the development of science and the consequent dependence on knowledge from the global north serve as motives for the acceptance of certain aspects of open science in recent years. But we'll get to that in a minute. The development of psychology in Latin America has been varied in a large number of countries in the region, but followed certain common paths in the continent. The first lectures of psychology were taught in connection with medicine, education, and law. At the beginning of the 20th century, laboratories were founded in Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Mexico, Peru, and other countries, following the recognition that a scientific experimental approach was essential to understand the complex phenomena that were of interest to society. Although the first graduate program was founded in Mexico in 1938, it was almost 10 years later that psychology was made a course of study in its own right, and the graduate programs were founded in Colombia and Chile. Today, we believe there are between 1,500 and 1,800 programs of psychology in the region. We're working on a precise counting and description of those programs, as I will tell you at the end of this presentation. We also have rough accounts of over 1 million psychologists in Latin America, but we lack a precise knowledge on how they are distributed, how they practice the profession, and how they impact important areas such as mental health and well-being. Open science has been well received in Latin America. Although open science has many expressions and even schools of thought, the main expression of it in the Latin American region has been open access because it addresses budgetary constraints to obtain scientific information. You know that the cost of databases is high, and you may imagine that this cost can be a heavy burden on the budget of any institution of a poorer country. The spread of open access during the last 2 decades had positive effects on the acknowledgement of science produced in the region. There is ample complex set of events and variables, including social, political, economic, and technological variables, that has encouraged the main indexes, the Web of Science and Scopus, and many databases to recently include a number of journals published in Spanish, giving scientists around the world access to the research produced in this continent. Thus, an increased access to academic publications and increased impact of Latin American science have produced a positive feedback on the production of articles in all areas of science, including psychology, of course. In fact, Latin America is one of the regions of the world with the fastest growing production and consumption of scientific knowledge. Other problems, however, have ensued. Among them, the lack of resources that previously affected access to publications is now affected the capacity to publish research produced in the region. As we all know, many high-impact open access journals charge the researchers per publication, and the prices are not easy to pay with very limited budgets, or even worse, out of pocket of the researchers. I know well that some journals have special programs to decrease this negative effect, but still, this remains a problem that is clearly identified. Scientific journals in the region have grown tremendously, which is good news, but remain underfinanced to face the demands of the publishing and scientific communication worlds. Other aspects of open science, such as communication with other researchers and participation in large-scale cutting-edge research, are being adopted at a slower pace. Language barriers, compounded with education constraints, result in important difficulties for most of the populations to achieve functional bilingualism. As you know, all of the Latin American countries have as their first language Spanish or Portuguese. So acquiring a second language becomes an additional effort in the education process that is not accessible to large segments of the population. This linguistic barrier makes resource sharing and exchange with peers in other latitudes less effective. There are many variations among countries, but overall, there is ample space for improvement. My point with this is not simply lamenting the situation, but pointing areas that require special attention by governments, academic communities, and individuals if we really want to achieve the full potential of intellectual capacity of humanity as a whole, which is in the base of open science. Now, I believe academic and professional organizations have a role to play in the promotion, adoption, and improvement of open science as a movement. For example, as you may see in the slide, national agencies for science should promote collaborations in ways more effective and imaginative than what we are doing today. I know some countries have extraordinary cooperation programs that have contributed to make science a universal enterprise. But configuring those programs on open science principles might be a necessity of our times. Similarly, other organizations such as journals, as well as databases and indexes, can identify specific areas in which they may contribute to achieve those goals. I understand that some of these organizations may not see this as being in their best interest, but this is part of the challenge that we have to address if we want to make science more universal, transparent, accountable, innovative, and in general to benefit humanity. As recent events have shown us, there are clear limitations in our model of knowledge development that surface in times of crisis and cannot be ignored for the future. In my view, IUPsyS has an important role to play in the strengthening of this movement in the behavioral sciences. Being this the most influential organization of psychologists in the globe, we have a capacity to identify benchmark models and improve on learned lessons to better the state of basic and applied research in the majority regions of the world. Before finishing, I would like to introduce a project that I believe can play an important role in favor of open science in psychology in the Latin American region. The Observatory of Psychology in Latin America has been developed with the support of IUPsyS, the Colombian College of Psychologists, and the Colombian Association of Psychology Training Programs. But in the context of a series of capacity building meetings organized during the past few years, we were able to identify some limitations in information and in our capacity to develop a strategy for the promotion of psychology in the Latin American region. For example, we realized that we do not have a precise information about the number of training programs in psychology in the region. We only have an approximate guess on the number of psychologists in Latin America and their professional and scientific roles in society. Thus, OPAL was created with the purpose of collecting and analyzing information that we can use to assess areas of development of psychology in Latin America that may be used by organizations, policymakers, and individuals to make decisions related to the connection of psychology with the diverse societies in the region. In relation with our topic today, OPAL can serve an important role in the promotion of open science in relation to psychology, both through data analysis and through our social network called Comunidad Psi or Community Psi. I hope you visit our website soon. We will be very happy to hear your ideas on how our initiative can improve the capacity of psychology to be more open in every possible way that serve our societies better. Thank you very much, and I hope I will see you soon.
And that was a really good presentation to end our symposium speakers with a demonstration of a very real situation where some of the issues to do with open science might cause particular difficulty. So thank you very much. And we have had some questions come in, but I would just like to say thank you to all of our speakers. I don't want to take up too much time with that because we do have some talks. We've got one which perhaps Sarah could answer first of all, which is about pre-registration and the possibility of self-plagiarism. Want to answer that question, Sarah?
Sure. Certainly from Wiley's perspective, there's no self-plagiarism. It did used to be an issue, and many journals would reject an article if it had already been published somewhere online. But certainly things have changed within the last 2 years, and most journals would certainly allow you to publish a preprint now and wouldn't consider it self-plagiarization. I would check the guide for authors for the journals, but most will allow it now.
Okay, so I don't know if Daryl or Abby want to add anything, as you're both involved closely with journals. Abby, have you got anything to add in relation to the IGP?
Yeah, I would say I just want to distinguish preprints from self-plagiarism in the sense that we wouldn't consider an article that's been pre-printed to be plagiarized, but we do often have situations where authors unintentionally reproduce a lot of their own work in an article, and that would count as self-plagiarism. If only half the article's new, for example, we wouldn't consider that substantially new.
Okay, thanks. And Daryl, have you got anything to add?
Nothing in particular to add really, but they're very different entities, but I would encourage people to very much engage with the preprint approach as well, because it's a nice, easy way of getting your science out there quickly.
Yeah. There was a direct question to you, Daryl. Have you got it there? Would you mind reading the question out if you have it, and then attempting to answer it?
Indeed, I haven't actually haven't written it down verbatim, but I think the question was about using registered reports and the idea of a stage 1 and a stage 2 report. And the question was about writing style and whether or not there's any tips we should adopt when writing a stage 1 report, which is that first part of your article with the introduction and the method section before you collect the data. And my advice is quite straightforward, which would be you would make sure it's about detail and about clarity. It's about ensuring you have clear outline of every step of the process that you're going to engage in. So certainly what is the case when registered reports are rejected or are asked to be revised, which is often the case, is because individuals haven't given a good justification of a particular aspect of their of the scientific process. It could be their analysis plan, the type of measures, it could be the statistical power calculation. So to me, I would urge anyone using registered reports to follow the links in the Open Science Framework, where Chris Chambers and his colleagues have got very detailed Q&A in guiding people through the frequently asked questions to avoid any of those pitfalls that people fall into.
Thank you. I don't know if anybody else wants to add anything to that. Okay, so there's a question which I can open to everyone here, which comes from Nicola Gale, and I'll read it out. Does the panel have a view on the economics of publishing in relation to making good science available? Should open access be the desired mode of publication across the board? If yes, where should the economic costs fall? Are APCs the right approach? What economic model is likely to make the best science? I think maybe Haida, I haven't asked you to speak yet, but it'd be good to get a response to you in relation to science generally, because clearly, you know, the International Science Council represents all science. Who should be paying? She can't hear so well. Okay, so maybe I'll open it up then. So I'll open it up. Herman, you mentioned the cost, so maybe you would like to have a go at answering that one.
Yeah, actually, Abby mentioned this in her presentation. Someone has to pay, and you have to ensure the sustainability of the journals. And I think a general approach is that, of course, we don't want to have an approach that doesn't benefit either the market or the researchers or the institutions. And putting this together is really a difficult task. Something I like to point, because I know this audience knows very well that difficulty, but I would like to point that it is important to understand that there is no one size that fits all approach here. So we really appreciate that some organizations and some journals make that distinction, and sometimes they make special arrangements for researchers coming on open access, researchers coming from countries like the ones that were mentioned by Abby that do not have high budgets and so on, to pay lower fees on open access. Unfortunately, that is not widespread, and that means that those researchers will not seek open access journals of quality that were mentioned before. But I think we'll be getting there, and there is an understanding both on the publisher side and the governments or the funders and also the researchers that we all have to make a little effort if we want to get our publications out there, getting all those citations and all of that, but at the same time offering open science in general, not only open access, but open science in general to countries around the globe.
I don't know, Sarah, if you've got any thoughts about that from the publisher's point of view, as in the end, the profits. Obviously, benefit associations for the publishers are commercial organisations.
Yeah, I mean, I think as Herman mentioned, we're looking for a kind of sustainable future, which ensures that we can continue to publish the journals. One of the things that we and a lot of other publishers do, we work with an organisation called Research for Life. And previously, we worked with them to offer access to subscription journals for free in a number of different low and middle income countries or at very reduced price. We're actually working with them, not just Wiley, but lots of publishers around open access as well. So countries like Ethiopia, Tunisia, Cuba, Serbia, they all can publish open access for free in any gold open access journal. So we're in a sort of transitional stage, and I think it's in all of our interests to enable everybody to be able to publish open access, whether that's through waivers, discounts, or through their institutions. But that's certainly sort of the direction that we're headed.
It's really helpful. I mean, one of the things that's concerned me for a long time is the potential colonisation of more free stuff going out to low middle income countries and less coming in. Our science needs to change with everybody involved in that. So that's a really good and reassuring point. Can I just ask again?
Can I just make one point just on this, because it's such an important issue, and thanks, Nicola, for raising it. I mean, to me, what concerns me is that if you look across the entire portfolio of journals in psychological science, even alone, what is concerning is the broad range in price. And that suggests to you that clearly there's people who are charging way too much for open access, and there's people who are being a bit more balanced about this. So what I'd like to see is a more honest and open debate about that. I'm not going to name any publishers here. Wiley are obviously very good, and there are sponsors here, so I'm not thinking of Wiley at all. But there are other mainstream publishers which clearly are charging nearly £3,000, £4,000, £5,000, never mind dollars, for articles. And even if we look at medicine, which is an area which alarms me even more. So if you look at something like Plus Medicine, they charge nearly about, I think it's about £8,000 for an open access article. Whenever you think, science and medicine is there to help us, and help the world in any global pandemic, for example. So I think we really need to think carefully about it. And the final thing I'll say is that, of course, as an academic, I've always had this slight grievance, which is, why is it that we are providing the copy for free all the time for publishers to make a lot of money? That's not to say that publishers do an incredibly good job of really getting our science out there. So it's about getting that balance right, and I think we should be not afraid to have that conversation.
And of course that relates also to reviews, which of course are getting reviews is challenging. I'm sorry to put you on the spot, Sarah. Have you got anything to add to that? And then I'll open it up.
I think, but I'm going to talk specifically about, I don't mean to make this a Wiley thing, but I'll talk about my program because that's all I know about. And certainly for our psychology program, 70% of the journals that we publish are on behalf of organisations like IUPsyS and the British Psychological Society and the American Counselling Association and many other different organisations. And they're a major source of revenue for those organisations too, sometimes their only source of income. I can't talk for everybody. What I know from our program is that the profits that we make go back to those organisations, not 100% obviously, but the vast majority. So that's the reason really that we need to ensure a sustainable future, at least for our program. I can't speak for others.
Okay, fine. Does anybody want to add anything to that? Abby or Herman? Haida is having a connection problem, so I'm really sorry about that.
Yes, I think I'd just like to reiterate what Daryl said, that it's a very complicated balance, and it's probably in all our best interest to have a transparent discussion about it. I get a lot of outreach from authors who want to know how much they need to pay to publish an IJP, because because it's a bit of a Wild West out there. So yes, it would be good to have an honest and open conversation about this.
So given so many of the, not just Wiley, who publish our journal, but other publishers do publish for international organisations, it is those international organisations, possibly through the ISC and in other fora, that can actually put that pressure on, notwithstanding that the income comes back to those. But that is where the parity cross journal, certainly if I wanted to get the highest rating for a paper I publish in my area, I would have to pay a lot more, because that journal's ranking. And I think that comes down to issues to do with metrics, and the metrics that journals have does sometimes relate to the amount they charge to publish them. And that's a very, very general comment, and it doesn't apply across the board. But I mean, it is a commercial exercise. Can I ask a general question, really? And that's for everybody. What do the panel see as being the most important barriers to open science practice? And we've talked about obviously the cost, but I mean, Haman, do you want to say, as someone who comes from an area where science is really, really prolific, but where some issues arise?
Yeah, I mean, of course, it's growing very fast, which is great, but there's still ample space for that growth. I would like to point to one barrier that I can see there, and it is the way that we relate to the academic careers of people. And since we are promoting and putting so much emphasis in the promoting systems based on volume of production and also based on impact, those two factors I think tend to promote practices that are not the best for open science. And I don't want to mention necessarily those that are just dishonest, openly dishonest, but in general, that promotes that you divide your paper or your data in several papers. That promotes that you tend to select certain journals and not others. That promotes that you tend to make, at least that's the way I see it, fake collaborations based on power and other issues, instead of, I don't want to be too idealistic here, but instead of bring the real good aspects of collaboration that we all want to promote. So I think there is a space for work with universities and the general health and knowledge systems in the different countries, trying to change this from volume to quality. And I understand some universities are changing that. And for example, for promotion, they ask a specific professor, why don't you bring to your vita the main 5 publications that you have in the last 5 years, instead of bringing the 50 publications that some people may get up to. And that means that they will center on really high quality of research, instead of trying to behave sometimes in predatory ways as well, and in other cases in ways that we really don't want science to go in that direction. I'm sorry if this sounds a little bit a little bit crude, but this is something I can see from academia and from my own experience with some colleagues.
It's a point I'm sure we all agree with. Heidi, I think you've got a bit better connection now, did you?
Thank you. I'm sorry
Really
about this. Very frustrating. I hope you can hear me. I just did want to thank all the other presenters for very, very interesting talks, and I'd love to connect you with the steering group and the networks that we're working with on our future of scientific publishing and scientific and scholarly publishing project. I think they could really benefit from engagement with you, and just also to say what I've picked up in your discussion so far. You mentioned some difficult conversations that do need to happen at a global level, and I think that is the responsibility of an organization like ISC, working closely with its members to make sure that those conversations are happening across issues, across sectors, across actor networks. It's clear just from a panel like this that there's so much happening, but there's quite a lot of fragmentation in initiatives at different levels of governance as well, from the global to the regional to the national. And we do need to try and convene that discussion, and with powerful partners like UNESCO try to come up with frameworks for action at a global level that are inclusive. So for me, your question, Pam, about the main barriers, I do think the persistent inequalities in science systems across the world is a major barrier that has to be addressed. I think the new geopolitical context for science, with new barriers to international collaboration, from funding to, trends towards and concerns about research security and trends towards scientific nationalism, is something that should concern all of us. And I also think, as Germán has pointed out, that we need to look very critically at the enabling systems for openness, and many of our business as usual scientific approaches and practices, including about evaluation systems, rewards, incentives, are barriers that need now to be addressed. I also wanted to say, and this is not a criticism of the panel at all, but we do tend to, when we talk about open science, we all acknowledge that it's also about openness to society. But there's not much debate happening on that front. And I think we need to find a way of ensuring that that notion of engagement, real meaningful engagement with society, is part of our debates. Thanks so much, Pam.
Thank you very much. Okay, we're nearly at the end, so before I say one final point, so just one point that everybody wants to make. Germán, would you like to add anything?
No, thank you. I think we really need to engage with, as Heidi said, with governance at all levels, and I'm sure IUPsyS has a role to play here, and also the governance of many of our organizations, publishers, and so on. And that has to be, as Heidi said, an open discussion in many levels that includes, of course, researchers, but also I like that very much, Heidi, to society, which is in the end the ones that we have to respond to, because they are providing a lot of what we use for doing our research and to provide back some of the results of our work. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Thank you. Quick point, Daryl?
I'll be very quick. Science is a series of behaviors. Therefore, those individuals who are watching, who are scientists and psychological scientists, think about one of your behaviors which you could turn into being an open science behavior, and that will be an important step forward.
Thank you, that's really good. And Abby?
Thanks. I think that open science, if we truly want to be, if we are serious about pushing it forward, is going to require some scaffolding for under-resourced, low and middle-income countries. There's no doubt about it. And we have to think that through, and maybe that requires a paradigm shift from us. So yeah, and thank you. This has been a really stimulating panel.
And Sarah, just one quick one before I make a few final comments.
Just, I would say psychological science is relevant to so many people, practitioners, not just researchers, and it's really important to get your research out into the world in order to change behaviour, everything from teaching to global pandemics. And I'm really excited about this change, and yeah, I hope to see us progress and work together to be more open in the future.
Thank you. So I'd like to thank you all for speaking and contributing to this. This is just the beginning of a conversation. The International Union of Psychological Science is taking this forward as an initiative, and of course we are contributing to the ISC UNESCO response. So thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the Congress, and yeah, I think hopefully a screenshot will have been taken throughout this, so we'll actually have a picture of us all, even though we couldn't meet in person. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
For you were started since you left Sorrento, dear. Birds and flowers in profusion seem to add to my confusion.